Big welcome, everybody. Welcome to this ExChange webinar. My name's Paul Willis. I'm a Professor of Adult Social Care here at Cardiff University, and I'm the Director of our new centre, CARE, which stands for Centre for Adult Social Care Research. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Jeremy Dixon to be presenting this webinar today about doing adult safeguarding with service users and carers. Before I hand over to Jeremy, just a couple of things to note. That we are recording this session today. That will be available through the ExChange YouTube site after this webinar. So if people have to leave early or want to share this with other people in your organisation, you'll be able to do that, and you'll have a link to that. And we'll also be sharing Jeremy's PowerPoint slides from today as well after the session. But let me start with introducing our speaker today. So Dr. Jeremy Dixon is a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Bath. He joined the university there in 2012, having worked for 3 years as a senior lecturer in social work at the University of West of England prior to that. Jeremy is a qualified social worker. He qualified in 1998 and worked in a variety of mental health services in statutory and voluntary sectors. And this includes work at community mental health teams, drug and alcohol teams, and work at forensic mental health. He has a number of research interests, and these include the views of people with mental health problems on their own mental health care, the views of carers towards mental health care, and how professionals interpret law and policy. Jeremy is the president of the International Sociological Association's Research Committee on the Sociology of Mental Health and Illness. He's co-director of the Centre for Deaf and Society at the University of Bath, and is a board member of the journal Health, Risk and Society, and vice chair of the Health Research Authority's Social Care Ethics Committee in England. And I'm really excited to say that Jeremy will be joining us here in CARE and the Centre for Adult Social Care Research from the 1st of April as our first reader in adult social care. So we're really looking forward to that. Jeremy also has a new book out, published through Policy Press. It's called Adult Safeguarding Observed: How Social Workers Assess and Manage Risk and Uncertainty. So let me hand over to Jeremy. Jeremy, thanks very much for taking this webinar today. Really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments. So it would be great to hear from you later on. So this presentation today focuses on the book which Paul was mentioning earlier on, and I'm focusing specifically on one chapter where social workers talked about how they managed relationships with people when they were doing adult safeguarding. And I'm talking here about their relationships with service users and also with carers. And I use the term carers here to refer both to family carers and to paid carers, such as social care researchers. So the book was based on several questions, which I have set out here just to give you a bit of context. So I've always been interested in the ideas around sort of risk and how people manage risk. When I did my doctorate, I worked with offenders with mental health problems, and I had to start thinking about how we manage risk and use sociology to do that for the first time. So I've been interested in this topic for a long time, but I came to adult safeguarding because the English legislation refers to work with adults at risk of abuse and neglect. And so it seemed like a good opportunity for me to investigate this topic, particularly as the Care Act 2014 made safeguarding a statutory duty for the first time in England. So I had these questions here, which is, how do social workers interpret safeguarding duties as laid out by the Care Act 2014? What sources of information do they draw on when assessing and managing risks? How do agency policies, procedures and cultures influence the way in which social workers assess and manage risk? And to what extent are the views of service users themselves considered throughout the process? So let me quickly give a bit of context in terms of adult safeguarding law and policy. So in the book itself, I give a chapter to this. And at the beginning of the chapter, I note that when I was doing my social work training, which was way back in about 96 to 98, nobody really talked about the idea of adult safeguarding. The concept hadn't really taken off. So there was modules which people took, which were focusing specifically on child protection. In fact, there were double modules, and there wasn't really anything related to adult abuse and neglect. There was an adults module, and that had a couple of sessions on elder abuse, but we didn't talk about adult safeguarding in the way that we've come to do now. So in order to try and unpick that, it's useful to look at some of the milestones which have taken place, which have led to adult safeguarding becoming noticed. And in the book, I start from the 1960s, but because of time constraints, I'm going to focus on the 1980s here and onwards. So in the 1980s, we started to see several individuals and groups advocating for elder abuse to be recognised and for people to do something about that. So Melvin Eastman, who was a social worker in London, wrote a book about elder abuse and had written several articles in things like Community Care and New Age, highlighting these issues. And initially he referred to a term which was used quite a lot at the time, which was called granny battering, which was drawing on the concept of baby battering, which had been used within child protection in the 1970s. And he tried to start to make the case in these magazines for there to be more focus on these issues. At the same time, we see legal commentators starting to pick up on these issues. And in the 1990s, we'd see the Law Commission pick up on this issue, particularly when they were looking at mental capacity law. Further consideration came through inquiries in the 1990s, particularly the Beach House inquiry, in which older adults had been abused, and Long Care inquiry, where people with learning disabilities had been abused. And concerns started to be made by the police and by academics around people with learning disabilities who are being moved to the community from long-term institutional care and their ability to look after themselves and protect themselves from abuse. So because of these concerns, the government introduced guidance in 2000. So the guidance was called No Secrets, Guidance on Developing and Implementing Multi-Agency Policies and Procedures to Protect Vulnerable Adults from Abuse. So that's quite a mouthful, so people tended to just refer to No Secrets. So this didn't have any legal status, but it did start to get practitioners to identify how they ought to manage these issues for the first time. And as the title suggested, there was an emphasis on starting conversations and helping people who were seen as vulnerable, such as older adults or people with learning disabilities, to identify abuse and for local authorities to start to take some steps to tackle that. As time went on, the local authorities started to put procedures in place, but there was some differences amongst local authorities. So research identified that it was a bit patchy in its implementation, which I'll come to talk about later on. There was also some pushback from the Association of Directors for Adult Social Services, who started to question the notion that we should be talking about vulnerable adults. So as personalisation started to become introduced as a policy, and the idea that people ought to be encouraged to have their own budgets, this notion of vulnerable adults started to go a bit out of vogue. And so the terms adults at risk started to be drawn upon more, and this was used in the Care Act 2014. And before the Care Act came into being, there was more inquiries from 2010 onwards, particularly the Mid Staffordshire NHS Foundation Trust inquiry, which had focused on abuse of older adults on older adults wards, and the Winterbourne View inquiry. Winterbourne is quite close to me geographically, and in the hospital, private hospital, which had been established there, a number of people with learning disabilities had been abused, and there'd been an undercover documentary done by the BBC programme Panorama, where they'd filmed that abuse and shown it during the documentary, which had again flagged this gap in law and policy about dealing with these issues. So the Care Act 2014 came into place in England, and it made adult safeguarding procedures statutory for the first time. But if we look at the actual law, it's still fairly slim. There's only sort of 5 sections under the Care Act which deal with abuse and neglect. So the Care Act gives local authorities a duty to set up a safeguarding adults board, which they lead, and has other key partners, noticeably in people who are commissioning services and the police, but also other people can be invited to that. There's also a duty to conduct safeguarding adults reviews if there's serious problems in care which appear to have been missed, so that lessons can be learnt. And the key bit really is section 42, which is laid out here. So this identifies what local authorities should do if they have cause to suspect that someone in their area is being abused, or they've got evidence that that's taking place. So in England, what it says is this section applies where a local authority has reasonable cause to suspect that an adult in their area has care and support needs, whether or not the local authority is meeting those, is experiencing or at risk of abuse and neglect, and as a result of those needs is able to protect themselves against the abuse or neglect. So in those cases, the local authority must make or cause to be make inquiries. So it can devolve those inquiries to other bodies who might then report back to them, such as care staff. So there's care and support statutory guidance, which supports the Care Act, and that identifies a number of different types of abuse and lists physical, sexual, financial, discriminatory, domestic abuse, psychological, modern slavery, and organisational abuse as particular types of abuse which people might look out for. They're not the only types of abuse. It's not supposed to be an exhaustive list, but they're there to give social workers and other professionals some indication of what they should be looking for. And the Care Act also says that social workers ought to be working within the principles of the Act, which are empowerment, prevention, proportionality, protection, partnership, and accountability. So let's now move on to theory and the research methods. So quite often when we talk about theory, social work students and social workers can switch off and see it something as quite difficult and sometimes a bit pointless. But I encourage people to think about theory, because otherwise it's quite easy just to rest on our sort of common sense assumptions that we have. And we need theory really as like a wall almost to bounce our ideas off so we can question them. So as I mentioned before, I used risk theories in my doctorate when I was starting to think about how risk is managed. And I returned to it in this book, albeit with a different focus on safeguarding practice. So there's a few things to say about the way that risk is theorized in the sociological literature. So there's a number of different people who are seen as key risk theorists, if you like. So the most well-known of that is somebody called Ulrich Beck, who was a German sociologist who was also at Cardiff for a period of time, coincidentally. So Ulrich Beck has written this book called Risk Society, and I tried to get to grips with that as a doctoral student. It's quite a complicated, almost impenetrable book, but essentially it lays out what you would call a grand theory. So this is the way that risk has come to be a predominant theme within modern society. And Beck uses the case study of environmental risk to look at the way that concerns about risk have come to predominate. And he uses this term that risk has replaced need in contemporary society, which he gives the term late modern. I won't go into that now. But essentially, he's saying that as we've become more developed in the world, we've created these new risks, and we are having problems controlling them. So things such as nuclear power and genetically engineered crops were created to try and tackle issues such as global poverty or the need for more resources, but they've created these extra risks, Beck would say, which are very difficult to contain and cross borders. So if we have a power station in one country, it might cause problems in another, for example. And these problems, he would say, affect everybody. And when he's talking about environmental risk, he says things like smog is democratic, meaning that it affects everybody, and you can't necessarily protect yourself from risk through having lots of money. So this is an idea which has become quite dominant in the social society, this idea about risk society. So that was one set of theories. Mary Douglas is another author. So she talks about cultural theories of risk, and she was an anthropologist who was also thought that risk had become a key theme within contemporary life, and was wanting to look at why that was the case. And her ideas were slightly different in the sense that she thought that risk was used to indicate things that had become taboo in contemporary society. So ideas like sin, for example, had gone out of fashion, she would argue, and so we start to use new ideas like risk to identify things that we want to avoid in contemporary life, and identify who should be taking care of those and managing them. So thirdly, we have governmentality theory. So it isn't a risk theory exactly, but it's been used by people to identify how risk is controlled. So Foucault came up with these ideas about how control is used in society, and he looked at things historically and showed how in previous eras you had kings ruling things through threat, essentially. So if you didn't obey the king, you might be expecting to be executed or to be tortured and what have you. So Foucault was saying over time, governors realized that they couldn't control people through that type of power, and so had to give power to other individuals, such as professionals, with the idea that people would draw on professional forms of power, such as power given by medicine or to economists, and would eventually be self-governing. So these ideas have been taken on by social work theorists. So if you read a lot of social work texts about risk, they argue that risk has replaced need within social work practice. And a common argument is that actuarialism is starting to drive social work. So I'll explain what this means. So the term actuary, it comes from insurance, but essentially what these people are arguing is statistics. So who is seen to be most at risk and who is seen to be least at risk are seen to influence professional practice, because people who are in practice are encouraged to draw on technical tools and are encouraged to manage their practice through using these tools. So one argument is that these statistical tools are coming to replace the way that professionals act. Other people have written about neoliberal agendas of choice driving risk decision making. So these people are drawing from Foucault and particularly from the theorist Nicholas Rose to say that we're impelled to choose about things like health services, but also how we manage risk in our everyday lives. So service users are encouraged to do this, the argument goes, and social services are only really used for people who are unable or unwilling to manage their own risks. So these theories are sort of dripped down to social work, and people tend to use bits and pieces of these theories, but not necessarily in a very measured way, in the sense that they just use one of those three theories or the other. So I tried to use this, I suppose, in my thesis, and I've tried to think of ways in which we might use these theories in practice later on. And one thing that I found very useful to do is to draw on the work of a theorist called Tom Hawley-Jones. So Tom Hawley-Jones was an academic at Cardiff University, and he had written about the big theorists and said, well, you know, these things are all very useful up to a point, but they don't really give us an idea about how people manage things on the ground. So in some of his papers, he'd used papers which had looked at how the police use their powers, and he'd drawn on this paper by Bittner in the 1960s, which identified that the police don't just use their sort of hard power, if you like, where, you know, powers of arrest, but they also use other powers such as you know, using threat, or maybe putting off making a decision to later, to try and manage power in a way which is going to be most usable within their own sort of context or society. So he was saying that all these sort of big theorists, you know, they're all well and good, but they're not very useful at helping us to understand what goes on the ground. And so I met Tom Hawley-Jones when I was a doctoral student, and several people have drawn on his work to come up with this triangle, which I'm outlining here. So this triangle's outlined by Nicola Gale and Patrick Brown, and they use the term risk work to think about how workers do risk decision making on the ground. So they're saying that in order to understand these things, we need to think about three things. So first of all, you've got what they call risk knowledge, or knowledge is, which is a bit of a garbled thing grammatically, but what they mean here is that people might have several forms of knowledge that they draw on. So as social workers, we might draw on policy, we might draw on statistical risk assessment tools, for example, and we can't just use those purely. We've sometimes got to interpret those in some way. So they're saying that interventions might draw on risk knowledge, but they have to be interpreted in some ways. And we also have social relationships to consider. So we have to think about how we work with individuals, but also with maybe other professionals from other organizations as well. So these things cause tensions which individual workers and organizations have to manage. So Brown and Gale are saying in order to sort of map these things out, it's useful to have this concept of risk work to think how it works in practice. So when I was doing the literature review of my book, I had a look at what other people had done when thinking about adult safeguarding. And these authors didn't specifically use the concept of risk work, but I've tried to sort of slot it into these three areas just to give myself some helpful information about what was already known. So previous research identifies that social workers draw on law and policy quite heavily, perhaps unsurprisingly, when managing risk. Secondly, there has been research in the past, pre-Care Act, which had looked at what social workers do in England and what models they use. And I'm very aware that there's a different legislation influencing safeguarding in Wales, by the way, but I'm focusing specifically on England here. So in the previous research, there was three models which were used. So safeguarding specialists were sometimes used in local authority teams. In other cases, specialists were used to identify what high risks and to sort of manage them. And in the third group of local authorities, safeguarding was seen as everybody's responsibility. So essentially everybody had to do it and there was no specialist to help them. So there is some indication that social relations were thought about by social workers and other professionals. And this piece of research by Macready, which I've identified in the third box, states that it was embraced by some people, that safeguarding was embraced, but other people identified difficulties. So people within different sectors, such as the care sector, local authority care sector, the police, nurses and social workers tended to use the term to suit their own best interest, and social workers had problems enforcing it because it wasn't a statutory power at that point. So what did I do in my research? So I used a term, a research method known as ethnography. So in practice, what this meant was that I went to 3 local authorities in England and observed what they did. So I sat next to people who were doing adult safeguarding work in the office, and I observed what they did, but also asked them what they were doing. So when I spoke to social workers about how best to do this, they suggested I sit next to them and look at the screen, and most were quite comfortable with me doing that. And so I watched some people who were doing screening assessments, and I then attempted to do some observation of people doing longer term assessments. But because of the way the local authorities worked, it wasn't very easy to do that because that work wasn't generally planned. So in the end, I had to sort of lump for interviews instead for that group. So I did interviews with all participants, but I did the observation on people who were doing the initial, what they know called triaging work separately. So 17 people who did triage were observed and interviewed, and 14 people who were more involved in long-term work were just interviewed only. Okay, so let me move on to the findings. So as I mentioned a bit earlier on, there were several models which were identified by researchers from King's College, Graham et al. And the models which I saw local authorities using were slightly different. So people didn't tend to have these specialist workers that I talked about before. But in the first local authority, there was an initial referral team who picked up all the safeguarding concerns which would come in via a team of unqualified workers who'd sort of see these things and pass them on. So initially, this initial referral team would pick everything up, and they'd usually flag that where there were safeguarding concerns. In most cases, they pass that on to a safeguarding team who do an initial assessment. So the safeguarding team would look at the referral, see if they thought it met the criteria or not, and would either sort of reject it or pass it on to somebody else on that basis, or in some cases they decide that they could do something short term and they would do those actions themselves. In other cases where they thought it needed a longer term response, they made a referral to the adult community team and would ask that team to pick it up. In the second 2 local authorities, which I've given the pseudonyms Gamsbury and Armsbury, they too had these initial referral teams, but the safeguarding adults teams tended to stay involved a bit more. So they either did the work themselves longer term, or they did it in conjunction with the longer term teams, where they might give the workers in those teams supervision and give them quite specific directions about what they ought to be doing. So let's move on to the findings. So as I've identified a bit earlier on in the theory section, there's some theory in the social work literature which identifies that risk thinking has become sort of totalizing in social work. So particularly the book by Stephen Webb called Risk sort of gives the idea that risk thinking has totally sort of taken over social work practice, and that workers have got very little discretion. And he also claims that actuarial, statistical thinking is sort of driving social work practice. My research didn't really support that contention. So when you spoke to social workers about risk assessment tools they were using, notably quite a few of them didn't realize that they existed at all. But some people did know they existed and were able to explain them. So one worker here, Judith, says the risk matrix is one where you've got 5 down one column and 5 on the header of the likelihood and severity. So it's very unlikely to happen to, it's very likely to happen, and it will cause no harm to, you're going to die. So that's the kind of scoring. So people were able to identify that there was a sort of matrices, but people didn't really believe this was drawing on statistical evidence, and there wasn't really any evidence that people were using these statistical risk tools in any of the local authorities. However, risk thinking and risk policies did affect the way in which local authorities worked. So Rachel here says, we used a risk tool to write down who was involved, what they felt the risks were. This helps so agencies know what each other are thinking. It's a living document. We write a risk chronology and set out what happened when. So although there's not much evidence of statistics sort of driving practice, risk tools were used to sort of try and encourage people to look at things regularly and to share information. So the other contention which is used in the social work risk literature is that risk thinking is very neoliberal. So I mentioned this idea before that several authors have written that service users are encouraged to assess and manage their own risk through things like personalization, and that social workers only really become involved if people are unable or unwilling to do that. So again, I don't really think that was supported by the data, although there was some discussions about who should be held responsible for risk, which were going on, although it didn't quite play out in the way that the risk literature in social workers said. So Helen here talks about a meeting with somebody who has been seen to be high risk of vulnerability and financial exploitation. The service user she was talking about was using drugs problematically and was involved in sex work, and workers at the house supported housing facility she was working at were worried that people were taking her money and what have you. So Helen here says the aims of the strategy meeting were to pass the responsibility back because I didn't have any doubts that she had capacity. I felt that she had capacity. I felt this was something that they were working with her. They should be able to manage, but they, the supported housing workers, needed a bit of guidance about that. So the Mental Capacity Act tends to come into focus quite a lot within adult safeguarding work. And as we know, the Mental Capacity Act says that people have the ability to make unwise decisions. So in this case, the worker was identifying that the person in question had capacity, so they could make unwise decisions if they wish to do. So she was talking about who should be responsible for risk, but she's actually talking about handing responsibility back to the supported housing workers rather than to the person themselves. And this took me quite a lot of thinking to get my head around, but quite often social workers were identifying that people had the ability to take unwise risks, and also the ability to take risks that workers may not like. So they engaged in trying to support positive risk taking. And so this is an illustration of that, and it came about, quite often. So the other thing to note here is that when talking about these things, people also drew on policies. So a key policy within adult safeguarding has been a policy called Making Safeguarding Personal, which has been promoted by the local government association in England. And this was trying to sort of line up personalization and safeguarding, but also to identify that people should be encouraged to identify what risks they wanted to take in their own lives, rather than social workers just sort of coming in and doing what they felt was the safest thing. So social workers quite often identified that they needed to talk to the person themselves about the risk and should involve them wherever possible. But there was a bit of a disconnect between the principles that social workers talked about and the practice. So virtually everybody said, yes, we ought to talk to people about risk and identify what's important to them. But if you observe them doing it on the desk, they didn't always do that. And so if you ask them why that was the case, several different reasons were given. So the first one was that it's sometimes important just to work out if people are immediately safe. So Nicola here says, my first instinct would be to check that they were both safe. This is a husband and wife who weren't receiving home care. Sort of look at the immediate situation, how to rectify that immediately, to make sure they had food, water, somebody to support them, to get to the toilet, their personal care needs, etc. So in this case, Nicola's saying, well, I do want to ask them and talk to them, but we know that they're not getting basic needs, so we need to sort of sort that out immediately before we do anything else. So the second issue was that people did think that people ought to be talked about the risks that were involved, that is service users, but a lot of workers were just based in offices and doing things by phone. and they identified that there was problems with that. So Rebecca here says, in this case, it wasn't very practicable to speak to him over the phone because he seems to have some learning difficulties. There are some really complicated family dynamics, so I think a phone call wouldn't make any sense to them, like who I am, why I'm calling, you know. So in this case, the needs of the person and his carers was called into account, but there was other reasons why people felt uncomfortable doing things on the phone. So an example in another local authority was somebody talked about a older woman and allegations of sexual abuse, and he said, well, I'm not going to have that kind of conversation with a 90-year-old woman on the phone. So that definitely needs to happen in practice. So people were saying, well, okay, in some cases it's not appropriate to do it by phone or online. The other thing that was mentioned by lots of people was that the policy gives this idea that you ought to be working with people and asking them about the risk, but you know, not everybody wants to engage with that type of thing. So Margaret says it's not about taking over, is it? It's about working, you know, to find out what's important. The trouble with people like her is, you know, they don't engage. So how do you actually find out? I've never met her. I wouldn't know her if she walked past me in the streets. And in addition to that, people often only had 1 or 2 sessions with service users, so had difficulties managing things in the time available. So social workers identified the need to be transparent with risks. So Nicola here identified that there was a need to, you know, explain what safeguarding is. So she says that I always sort of say the council's got a responsibility to make sure that people are free from abuse, and we want to keep you safe. And people also identified, as mentioned earlier, the principles about the mental capacity. I'm going to speed up here slightly because I'm aware that I'm slightly running out of time here, so I won't read out all these quotes. One thing to note here is that people weren't always happy about the Mental Capacity Act. So although Sue here gives a positive account of it, some people felt a bit powerless with the Mental Capacity Act and felt like, well, how do we know when to step in and when not, particularly in the cases of self-neglect. And lastly here, people identified about the need to try and see the case from the service user's point of view, and that might involve a recognition that this might not be the way in which workers would want to manage risk in their lives, but it was important to, you know, sort of find out about what it meant to the person in line with the Making Safeguarding Personal principles. And in the same vein, some workers identified that people who had a tolerance for high-risk situations, it was important to know that, because sometimes if they were identifying that something was dangerous, there was a special reason really to step in and take quick action. The second point here, social workers were concerned to build relationships, and they also tried to educate people about abuse and neglect. So one thing that struck me was that you sometimes heard conversations in the room where people were saying, well, listen, you know, you don't have to take it, you know, it's, physical abuse isn't something which you should accept, and you know, there are things that you can do about it. So education was an important part. So in terms of family carers and care providers, a couple of different approaches can be noted. So approaches with carers tended to fall into 2 camps, really. So broadly speaking, most social workers were trying to be supportive of carers. So Lisa here says, carers, you know, they're a goldmine for this organisation. We're stretched and we need to take care of the carers. You know, carers come top of my list. So in this case, she was saying, well, there is an allegation of abuse, but in most cases of the carers, family carers, they're doing a difficult job, they're hard pressed. So we need to make sure that we're putting the resources into place to help them manage that. So essentially, she's indicating that some abuse may not be intentional, and it might just be because people are struggling with a difficult situation, such as managing somebody with dementia at home with very little help. In other cases, people were saying, well, actually, we sometimes need to be a bit more hard-nosed with family carers. So in this particular case, Marcia was talking about somebody who appeared to be financially abusing somebody who they had responsibility for under a lasting power of attorney. And they said here, I felt the easiest thing to do with these cases is to be transparent and say, look, in the situation, this is what's being alleged. So in this case, she said, well, you need to get the person in front of us, tell them what the allegation is, and make a judgment about whether they understand that and what they're going to do about it. So the second group of people is care providers. And in these cases, a number of things were going on. So a dominant expectation amongst social workers was that care providers, whether they be home care providers or managers or workers in care homes, should report in any incidences of abuse or neglect or things that went wrong within the care home to social services through the safeguarding process. So in other words, if there was a medication error, if there was a bed sore in a care home, if somebody got a scratch or an injury when they were being changed, the expectation was that care agencies should report that in. So this isn't really supported by the legislation. The Health and Social Care Act 2008 does say that there's a duty of candour to make things known to the Care Quality Commission when there's been a notifiable safety incident, and to tell family carers about that. But there's nothing to say they ought to be reporting it into safeguarding. But this was a sort of dominant expectation. So Mike here says, we want to hear if there's been a concern. It's not necessarily an admission of fault. And the reasons for this was that social workers felt that they needed to be able to map incidents which might not be that major, but might happen over time. And this was identified as a sort of good citizenship thing. So Isabel says, I think for them to see themselves as accountable that this has happened and shouldn't happen, and we need to report this. So there's this informal culture which had happened across all the local authorities that people ought to be reporting it in. So once that had happened, the way in which care agencies engaged had an impact on the trust between social workers and social care agencies. And Kerry here says, but I expect them to be saying things that I would find reassuring. And she was saying, I don't want to give them forewarning. I want them to tell me what they're doing. And if I just sort of tell them my expectations, they're just going to tell me what I want to hear. So people made differentiation between care homes they thought were good and bad, and that was sort of partly about how they reported in, but also historical knowledge about the care home fed into that. So sometimes when you noticed social workers ringing up particular homes, they'd make comments under their breath like, I don't know, Lodge House is shit and don't ever go to Lodge House, and those types of things. So that kind of thing had an impact on trust. So two responses took place as a result of this. So first of all, there was sort of requests to do things slash threats almost in some cases. So Nicola here says, we will contact them today and say, have you got care plans in place? Have you got updated risk assessments? How are you going to manage this concern? The only way you're going to do this is through an internal investigation as soon as possible. So quite often there was this sort of form of coercion about you need to do the paperwork. But secondly, some people recognised that actually these threats only had a limited value, because the reason that some of these problems arose was because of poor funding. So Patricia says, so I'm not dismissing their serious safeguarded cases. What I'm saying is we need to relook rather than patching up. I think it's a policy or commissioning. It's a much bigger commissioning thing, because you squeeze here and it's going to come up here. It has to, because it's the same resource. So if now Mrs. C needs lots of help, Mr. D is going to not get that, and Mr. D is going to be the next safeguarding. So very quickly, some conclusions. So as I identified, there's this theory within the social work and sociology literature that risk has replaced need within practice, and that this reflects neoliberalism. However, if we use the risk work framework, we can see that it's more complex on the ground, and that actually risk isn't necessarily a dominant culture in all cases. There's a number of things we can identify. So in relation to previous research, we see some commonalities. People are using law and policy quite closely. Social workers are drawing on personalisation particularly, and that's driving this idea that we ought to be promoting positive risk-taking alongside the Mental Capacity Act. So the interventions, which I mentioned, are different from the ones that have been flagged up in previous research, but there is very little evidence that actuarial decision-making is replacing person-to-person practice, as a number of people have contended. And social relationships is a key part of the process. And what we notice is that people identify that it's very important to talk to the people involved, but there's a number of things that people feel they have to follow because of the complexities of the situation on the ground, which I've outlined a bit earlier. So these do focus on maintaining trust, but these play out quite differently with family carers and paid carers. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Paul at this point because I've got about, I think, 10 minutes left for questions. So thank you very much for listening. And as mentioned before, this is part of a book, and this particular chapter can also be downloaded free.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for a really fascinating presentation. Lots for us to think about. So we've got 10 minutes for some questions. Okay, so let's go to Alison, another colleague of mine, Alison Tarrant. Alison, it'd be great to hear from you.
Hi, can you hear me, Jeremy?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name's Alison. I'm part of the Care Centre, and I've worked on safeguarding kind of peripherally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I come from a legal background, and you touched on this very briefly, and I wonder if you could elaborate on the role of kind of intention in safeguarding and how social workers looked at the matter of intention. I'm kind of intrigued by this. You talked about how there was your slide when you referred to informal carers, that if there were just kind of there were problems that if I understood you correctly, you were kind of suggesting that they wouldn't swing the whole safeguarding mechanism into action if there was kind of no intention. And there seems to be a discrepancy on this in terms of guidance I've seen from E and so on. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I can expand a bit on what I said actually about the carers because I was running out of time. So what I noticed, I think, when I observed people and listened to the interviews was that family carers, as I mentioned, got an easier ride, but a bit more than that, in fact, in the sense that social workers weren't always explicit with carers that a safeguarding process was going on in some cases. So one example I didn't talk about earlier on was a social worker was talking about a woman who was losing weight. It had been flagged up by the health visitor, and they needed to do an assessment and speak to the husband to find out what was going on. So in that case, the worker was saying, well, I didn't tell the husband it was a safeguarding investigation. So throughout the interview, I was saying, well, why is that? And she was saying, well, it would be very upsetting for him. You know, we didn't want to suggest to him that he was abusing his wife. And that was, I noticed that in a few interviews. So in some cases, people weren't even transparent about the process really at all. In other cases, they might be transparent about the processes, but, you know, sort of soften it a bit or talk it down in terms of, you know, what support can we offer you? And as I mentioned, yeah, in other cases, I think there was a more of it. We need to, you know, make a threat here. So I mean, sometimes a threat was made in a sort of friendly way, if you like. So it could be sometimes things like, well, you know, you're with your son, and you know, if you don't do anything about this, about the neglect, you know, you could get into trouble, or the police might get involved. So it was sort of couched in a, well, you know, we're trying to be supportive, but you know, here's this informal threat. At other times it was a bit more blunt. So and again, I think this did come down to intent and you know, what the evidence was. So in the case of the financial abuse I mentioned, I think they did feel that there was quite strong evidence of financial abuse, but they were saying, well, almost you've got to prove your innocence, come in with the, you know, the statements about how you're looking after the LPA, and that will affect how we take things from here. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. But so where the issue was just poor care,
yeah,
safeguarding processes were still activated, even if they were slightly under the radar.
Yeah, I mean, they were activated, but not necessarily transparently, I suppose is the easiest way to say it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you, Jeremy.
Any other questions from other people in the audience? Oh, there's a question from Helen. As a criminologist, this is all really interesting as the emphasis is on the risk posed by society to the individual, whereas the emphasis in youth justice risk assessment is very much on the risk posed by the individual to other people. So the question is, to what extent are screening tools used in adult social safeguarding? You have mentioned specifically exploitation and abuse. What about in the case of risk of falls? How are these viewed by practitioners? Is there still a lot of practitioner discretion about onward referrals?
So thank you, Helen. So people did have risk tools, but they, as I mentioned before, they weren't sort of pushing them in a particular direction. They tended to encourage people to identify, when they felt something was high risk or not, due to its severity or its repetitiveness. But after that point, people did have a lot of discretion. I suppose the seniority had an effect. So managers and senior practitioners were expected to take the sort of hard safeguarding decisions, if you like, and workers below that level tended to refer up and get advice in regards to how they ought to do things as a result of that. Specifically in relation to falls, that did come up a few times with care home referrals, and the responses I noticed was that people, quite often said to care homes, well, we want you to start documenting what you're doing here. So, in your own risk assessment plans, what are you doing to stop falls? And this was also the case with things like bed sores and other things within care homes. So the emphasis, particularly on paid carers, was trying to get them to do paperwork as a means of stopping the risk. Now, I'm not entirely certain that that's necessarily the most productive way to do it, but that's the way that it tended to happen. So there was quite an emphasis on getting paid carers to fill out some forms, essentially, and that was usually used as a measure to identify whether social workers felt the risk was dealt with or not. But there was quite a lot of discretion within that in terms of personal discretion.
Thanks, Jeremy. Helen, did you just want to briefly respond to that? We could see you now. It looks like you've unmuted.
Yes. Yeah, it's just really interesting. It's kind of the view more. So in youth justice, practitioners are really kind of, we're getting very fed up of the risk assessment process. It was overly bureaucratic, took an awful long time. And that was kind of where my question was coming from. And because of my naivety around adult social work, that's why I thought about falls. And I guess really some of that is about, you've talked really about a person or a carer perhaps being involved either as something that they're not doing that is causing, or perhaps they are doing that is causing harm to the individual. But something like falls is more about perhaps the environment needs to be tweaked or altered, and that doesn't seem to perhaps place as much blame on one individual or the other. And so I just think it was quite interesting the way you
I think that's interesting actually, but I think sometimes blame was placed with the individual, so even if it seems like an environmental thing. So if somebody was in the care home and they were falling, actually the example that I was talking about was, I think somebody had fallen and then died. So essentially what the safeguarding team was doing was sort of saying, well, we need to have an investigation into this and establish whether it was neglect from the care home in terms of they didn't have the proper policies and procedures into place to encourage people to use their walking frames or to that kind of thing. So it can be still be quite bureaucratic, I suppose, even if it seems like an environmental risk in some cases.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can see there are a couple more questions there in the chat from Kerry-Ann and Sophie, but we are out of time. So maybe we could just pass those on to you, Jeremy, and you can
sure. I'll put
put
my email address down the bottom, and if anybody wants to email me, I'll happy to answer those. So I'll give my Bath email address here. That's
a great idea. And just to remind everyone that we'll also circulate the recording today, a link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides. Thank you, Jeremy. A super fascinating study, and it's clear strength of your approach and design that you're able to get a much deeper, or generate a much deeper understanding of the kinds of factors that are informing social workers' decisions on the ground around how they manage quite complex safeguarding matters. So really thanks for sharing that work today, and hopefully people have opportunity to grab a copy of the book and learn more about the study and your work through that as well.
Great. Thank you for having me.
No problems. And we also have our first CARE event on the 21st of May about carers. It's a seminar on carers' wellbeing. It'll be hosted here in our Spark building on Maindee Road in Cardiff, and we'll circulate more details about that event soon. Big thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to everybody for coming along today. And hopefully we'll see you soon at a future webinar.